We're going to be, I'm Emanuele Bianchini. I'm here part of the weekly Wednesday of the Business School of AI with the Suda Jamte. And I welcome you all for attending this session. And looking forward for two very interesting people that will come and talk to us today. First of all, we'll have Susanna Raj, and she's an AI ethics researcher that has been part of the Business School of AI and has a very deep and interesting knowledge both on ethics, psychology, and technology altogether. And she'll be talking about the 5 stages of bias in the data as part of a master class and an introduction to AI ethics as we're following on later on with Dia Nguyen from AWS, and she's an AI ethicist as well, and she'll provide us her different perspective on the topic of AI and ethics and how this is going to be important moving forward as more and more people are getting involved and more problems can be solved, but there is always concern about solving the right problem with the right information, the right data. So I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of Suda and the Business School of AI. And Susanna, welcome. And
thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and welcome everyone. I'm happy to be taking the first part of this, weekly Wednesday and sharing with you my perspective on the 5 stages of AI/ML bias in the AI/ML life cycle. So I'm gonna be sharing a slide. Let me see if that works. Okay. So mostly I'm just gonna be talking. So whatever is on the slide is like a lot of information sometimes in the upcoming slides, but there are 5 stages in the whole AI/ML life cycle. And one of my favorite images that actually captures that very well is this one by Google. This image comes as part of the Google Fairness tool. And I picked this image because it's very simple and it gives a very simplistic overview of the bias, where human bias actually gets in the life cycle of an AI development. So they have put together this document, but I actually do believe that the bias actually gets in one stage before this. The first stage, according to them, is collecting data. The second stage, according to them, is labeling data. Third stage is training using chosen metrics and objectives. And the fourth one is models deployed. And the fifth one is the user sees an effect. And then it goes into a feedback loop, where then you again go into data collection, labeling, and metrics and deployment. So this is what's called the life cycle of AI. But I do believe that it starts one step before that, which is the conception and ideation stage. And I think bias actually gets in here. But I can tell you from experience, I worked in data collection, data labeling, and in the training and in the user effect. I worked in the 4 stages before this, but I have never worked in the conception and ideation. But I came, I started my journey in emotion analysis at a major big tech company. And when where I came in was at the user effects. That is where they found a problem that their algorithm or whatever their model was predicting was not actually making any sense. So they wanted somebody who comes with a psychology background to come and look at the data, because the model that they were training were actually part of human behavior, very closely related to human behavior, especially emotional behavior. So they asked me to come and take a look at what went wrong. But I went back, backtracked my steps, went all the way there to the training, to the data labeling, to the data collection, and I found my problem at the very beginning. And it was because of human bias in the data collection stage that had crept into the model that they were not even aware of. So that is how my journey into AI ethics started. At that time, I did not know that it was even called AI or even ethics. I was just like trying to solve a problem. Why is this not making sense? And how can I help? And where did the problem actually start? So digging into that, I came into this whole field of bias in data and how to solve for it. So I know that Dia is going to be talking to you about AI ethics more in depth. So I won't go into that. She won't be talking, but she will be taking your questions. So I think for you to ask her better questions, I'm going to talk about this one slide here, which is from Lionbridge AI. They are a data annotation platform that deals exclusively in image and voice and sentiment analysis and all of those data collections. So they have put together this slide on how biases get into data and how biases get into the collection and annotation part. So that they have divided it into two parts. And I thought that was really neat because not all biases of humans actually gets into the collection and annotation. Only some of them do. But it is interesting to see which ones actually transfer from one area to the other. This slide has too much information in here, but I'm going to be talking on some of them. As you can see in the first one, it says human biases in data. It says reporting bias, selection bias, overgeneralization, outgroup, homogeneity bias, stereotypical bias, historical unfairness, and implicit stereotype, prejudice, group attribution error, and halo effect. The ones that actually do get into the problem later in the collection and annotation are the group attribution, the halo effect, selection bias, and they also come the implicit stereotypes and implicit associations are heavily seen in the annotation and collection stages of data. And how they transfer in the second part of the image, they actually use statistical terms like sampling error and non-sampling error. I know this might be too confusing, but basically that's what it means. Sampling error is taking a population data that is not representative of the entire population. And non-sampling error is actually forgetting that there is even another population that should be included. So things like that are actually coming into play because of somebody's implicit association and stereotypes. So in the data collection stage, or even at the step in the ideation stage, somebody in there has to talk about these biases and have to have knowledge of these biases. In psychological research, where I worked before I came to work in the tech company, is that we have protocols in place that will help us guard against all of these biases, because it has been drilled into our head that we have all these biases, and every one of your team members also have all these biases. We should continuously guard against them, continuously have countermeasures that will, have checks and balances against each of these biases. My biggest surprise, actually, I was shell-shocked that if I can use that term, was that there was no such guards in place in big tech companies, and especially in AI development. It was very, very shocking to me because I thought, how can you not guard against these biases? Because we human beings have them. It's not like we are bias is not a 4-letter word like that's what I always used to say. And even now I believe that it's not a 4-letter word. It's not bad by itself because all of these biases helped us survive, and they all have evolved from psychological evaluation and evolvement throughout part of our history. They have helped us in some ways, and some of them are culturally based, and some of them are racially based, So some of them are really bad. We have to, actually come out of those biases. But most of them is not something you can help with. You cannot take out those biases from yourself, especially the one that is on this slide. It's right in the middle. After the bias blind spot, you can see confirmation bias and choice supportive bias at the end. Those are the two biggest biases that I found in data collection and annotation. The researchers themselves were very much looking to confirm their own hypothesis, but they were not even aware that that is what they were trying to do. So if I could give you an example, like one of the examples that if I can use that is they were trying to find stress in human emotions. I mean, stress is one of the emotions of human behavior, but they were trying to find stress, how to see if they can validate it with ground truth data. And as a psychology researcher, if I were actually brought in before at the ideation stage or at the data collection stage, I would have asked them to define the construct. So if you were like developing a facial recognition app or something, you bring me in, I would ask you, before I go and do data collection for you, I would ask you, can you define a face for me? Because that may sound like so silly, like you have never seen a face before. Why do you want me to define a face for you? Because if you don't define your construct, how you define your construct is how you will tell the data collection experts and the data collectors to go and collect your data. And it also how you will tell the annotation labelers to label them. So at the very beginning of it, I would ask you to define your construct for me. Even if it is a face, I would like to know, is this a face? Is this a face? And if I do this, is that a face? If the back of my head, is that a face? In art majors, the back of your head is a face. But in facial recognition technology, the back of your head is not a face. But children and even us, we can recognize our friends and family members in a large crowd or group just by looking at the back of their head. So that is also a part of your face. I would have asked you to define all part, if you were to defining your construct to me, I would have liked to see all shapes and sizes, all colors, all angles, all framing and all compositions, all different types of hair types and everything, different lightings. I would have asked you to define your face in so many different ways that construct itself would be so varied and diverse that now that with that definition, I would tell the data collection researchers to go out and collect data. Now they would be collecting data that would be representative of all human faces. I believe that is where, if you have seen the movie Coded Bias, I believe that is where the whole problem started. Nobody defined a face. And the people who were in the building, who were in part of the research team that was, doing the data collection, defining the problem statement, just simply went and said, facial recognition, okay, let's take an image of my face and let's, build the algorithm. And they probably did a lot of facial recognition by looking at their friends and whatever was available. And this is one of the things that happens a lot in psychology also and in AI development as well, is that people take whatever is available and then they use that as representative of the entire population. And you know what happened, right? facial recognition technologies don't work very well with dark color skinned people. That is the main reason that that's how the whole problem actually came about. In my opinion, if you were to let me analyze the problem, I would say it started there. You did not define your construct very well. Why I'm giving you that example is when I went into that emotion collection in emotion analysis and defining stress, and when I came in at the user effect stage, which is at this let me show at the last stage, and it wasn't working very well for them. I asked them, how did you define your construct? How did you define your variable that you are trying to, build your data set, build your model on? And I asked for the construct definition of stress. And usually when a psychology student asks you a construct definition, they are expecting a 20-30 page document that defines the construct beautifully from all angles and from all perspectives. They just jilted me around for a while, and they were like, oh, we don't know where it is, and we don't know, we don't have that file with us. And finally, after nagging for so many weeks, they said, okay, we have found it, we will give it to you. And I was that morning I was really waiting for them to give me a 20-page binder that I'm supposed to read for the whole day. So I kept the whole day free, and I got a sticky note. And exactly that's exactly what I got, a sticky note that defined stress. It was so shocking to me that that's all the effort they put into that they just, and one of them actually said, how did you come up with the sticky note definition of stress? And he said, I Googled it. And I was so, it was a shocking experience for me, but I found that repeated throughout my journey in the tech companies, and that is how they define. That is how much time they put into defining things, defining constructs before they do data collection. So if you want me to tell you where bias starts, it starts at the conception and data collection stage, and it starts at how you define your constructs. And here is, I'm going to give you a short, another example of this, of how this bias plays out in real life. This is a slide I pulled out of Quantlib last night because I wanted to show something that's not as popular as, everybody shows you the facial recognition tech, or this Amazon thing, or that Microsoft Tay, or something with Google's mislabeling human beings as gorillas. But I wanted you to see something that is even more serious, that may impact all of our lives, because we are all going to get older, and we are all going to have some form of cognitive decline over the years. How these algorithms are going to impact our life is through this. In this algorithmic training, and we don't know how they defined their constructs or what they did, but here is something that they have done. They have taken a limited range of different types of patients who were, who had memory loss, or who had some symptoms of, Alzheimer's disease. And they believed, this is one way, one of the biases, a major bias is a selection bias. They believed that sampling that they took represented the entire population. So they trained their model on it, and the trained algorithm predicted results. The people who were excluded from that were actually African Americans and Latinos and minority groups. They were not part of the training data. They were not part of the model that was trained. And this model actually said that they don't have early Alzheimer's because it wasn't trained to predict, it wasn't trained to see the symptoms in that population. So when it encountered that population, as the model was used and deployed on them, it said, they don't have Alzheimer's. This actually happened during the pandemic. This example I'm showing is for Alzheimer's disease, but this actually happened during the pandemic for African American communities when they were told that they don't have the same cardiac symptoms that other people had. They were actually turned away and sent home. Many of whom died because the doctors and the people and the models that were used were not able to see this population having the same symptoms as others, as the ones that they were more used to seeing. So this is how some of these things actually affect us. So these biases are not something, oh, it's just there up in the sky and, we can all guard against it. But no, unless you're actively trying to guard against it, it's going to creep into your model. And you have to do that active trying, active guarding by actually going, not only having diverse data sets, but you should also go and find data sets that will prove whatever your hypothesis is as wrong. You have to find your opposing predictions. Anything that you think is going to predict, find something that will predict the opposite. You have to actively do that. And the second thing that I found was that I don't have a slide that will give you a visual of what I was trying to tell them, is that when they were trying to do the data collection, during the data collection stage and during the model training stage, there should be a separation of the people who are actually doing both. But I found in the big tech companies that separation was not even there. And why we in social sciences really dogmatically, by protocol actually have that in place is that the person's, the other slide that I showed you, the experimenter bias, the subjective validation, the choice supportive bias, all of those biases will come in. Because if you are the same person who collected the data, and if you are the same person who is developing the algorithm and who is, doing the model design, that bias is not something you can eliminate at all. It's not possible to eliminate at all. It's not like whether you're a good person, bad person, doesn't matter. It's not possible to eliminate that. Choice supportive bias, experimenter's bias are not something that we can entirely eliminate from any project. So I would actually, my biggest thing while I was working in the corporate industry was to advocate for this, advocate for actually separation at every stage, actually having different people go and collect the data and having different people analyze the data, making sure the data was, going out and finding data sets that will actually prove your hypothesis completely wrong. All of those things takes time, takes money. And I found that the simplest answer I was given was out of scope. This is out of scope. This is not even possible. So why we can't do this? This is not profitable. This is not practical. So sorry, it can't be done. And now when we see the problems, they go back and say, oh, it's just human biases. I wanted to stop sharing and actually share this document. I hope you can see it. It's the Cognitive Bias Codex. And now at every major conference where the big tech companies are presenting, some researcher or some speaker there throws this codex out there. It says Cognitive Bias Codex. It says there are 180 biases, human biases, and we need to, guard against all of them because all these biases get into the data. The data itself is biased. As long as you put clean, well-processed data into the algorithms will function. Awesome. I tend to disagree with that. It's not that these biases are something that is existing somewhere up in the sky, but it is existing within you. It is existing within the researchers and within me. If you were to come and I was to give you my phone and ask you to take my contact list, all of my contact list, and categorize them by ethnicity, race, and gender, you're not going to find a lot of diversity in there because I'm not, that's just who we are. We like to mingle with people who look like us, who have our same interests, who come from the same culture, who share the same values. So you are going to find a lot of Indians. You are going to find a lot of women. That's what you're going to find. You're going to find very few Caucasian, very few African Americans, very few Latinos in my contact list. This does not mean I am a racist person or anything, but this is one of the human biases that we are all born with. We like to mingle with those that we we associate more with people who look like us, who think like us, who share our same lived experiences. So if I'm the data collection expert and you didn't define your construct very well enough to me, and you said go collect some faces, I'm going to collect faces that probably look more like me than you. And if you ask me to go and collect emotion data, I'm going to collect emotion data based on what I think is emotion. Unless you defined it in as varied a way as possible, I'm going to collect emotion data based on what I think it looks like in my home, whatever is the emotional construct that I grew up with, whatever was the emotional, cultural aspects of it that I was familiar with. That's what it's going to look like. So this is not something that you can, just because you throw a codex out there and you say there's 180 biases and that those biases are there, just guard against them. It's not going to work. What are your protocols, practical protocols you have in place to guard against each one? So I think I may be running out of time. Emmanuel,
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. But first of all, thank you very much for the very nice conversation explanation. I really like the fact of, yeah, look at your phone and there is bias right there. And, we're all biased in different ways. And, it's a very true statement that you're making. And I mean, I think there are a couple of questions from Sam, and in terms of, how can we improve, especially from a data collection and data separation, and it's a thing you probably kind of addressed in terms of being able to have multiple people involved. And there is also a question about who are the people involved in defining and constructing an AI model. This comes from Nandini, and if you want to just
okay, let me. What was the first question?
it was more. Let's see, it was farther up.
Yes, I see. There's a lot of. Okay.
Mitigation algorithms and how can we make models and data more inclusive as well as.
You have to make models inclusive by defining your construct in as varied as possible. That has been my take on it. And we all actually have an AI ethicist here who is much more well experienced in this, and she will give a better answer. But my answer is define your constructs in as varied ways as possible, because that's where everything starts. If you don't define your variables in a wider way, in a diverse way, then you are going to end up with problems. So that's where I see diversity coming in, and
Yeah.
diversity in the people in the teams is so important, because then there will be so many people opposing you and telling you opposing viewpoints, and bringing different cultural aspects to the dialogue, to the discussion. That's one area we need to have diversity in teams. The second area is to have make sure that every diversity data is diverse by actively looking into that. So could the data collector use same? I saw some question. What is that?
Yeah,
Use some tools to
I mean, I
detect.
think I think from the message I capture from what you're saying is like the more diverse the group is that are working on them building the AI models, the least amount of bias there is because of the human nature of each individual person. So I think, and I really have to thank you and Suda for bringing such a diverse community all together, and we can learn from each other. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity. If there are any other questions for Susanna, or we're ready to move on to.
And we'll pick up this topic back in class tomorrow for the career pivot in AI ethics class, because this is Susanna's area. She actually came in as a speaker to talk to us before she decided to come and teach this course. So maybe we can follow up with her on more questions as we, as people.
Susanna, if you want to share your LinkedIn
yes, sure.
People can find her in the class also. And we can, one of the things I just added is this codex bias thing that she was showing the picture. I added that. I just shared the link here. So there's a set of free resources related to AI ethics that we've just made it publicly open in the curriculum section of the course. So even if people are not taking the course, they can come and learn from this. So maybe we can add more resources on bias detection and mitigation resources and answer some of these questions there.
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dia Nguyen. She works at AWS as a senior practice manager in emerging technology and intelligent platforms. And she's an AI and ML ethicist with a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so looking forward to hear her perspective on the topic of AI ethics and how this could have an impact on our lives and now and in the future, and how could this become more of a responsible AI, and how can we all work together in this form. So Dia, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, Suda, and the opportunity to share with your group here today. I know that we're really here for question and answer, so I'm not going to talk a lot, but I wanted to really key in on a couple of things that Susanna said. And Susanna, it's great to see you again. We had the opportunity of serving together for Teams in AI, a challenge and hackathon several months ago. So good to see you in this environment. The great people stay together, right? I know they say great minds think alike, but we also see each other in common circles. So that's great. I wanted to share with you, I just made a couple of notes. And Susanna, when you were giving your description, one thing rung out to me, words matter, right? And I had this conversation with someone on a completely separate topic yesterday, but when you were talking about sort of understanding the face and how we phrase that and then annotate and collect data associated to that makes a difference in the outcomes when we start to train our models, right? And so just think about that, right? What I would say or describe as a face or anything for that matter might differ slightly than you would. And that's going to have a different context depending on the region that you live in, perhaps, or your background, or maybe it is maybe it's the language that you speak, right? Perhaps you think about it in the context of slang. And so slang in a different language might suggest something else. And so the completeness or the totality of that, right, is what we need to bring into the data. And that's what you were describing, right? So if I say a face is only, this part that I see here, but not including my ears, well, then when I train my model and the data that I use, then I'm going to be absent of perhaps certain characteristics that maybe we should consider, right? And so it was interesting to hear you, or it was great to hear you bring that up, because I think that that's part of it. And so when we start to think about ethics or responsible use and how that plays into how we train our models, how we collect our data, the completeness of our data, and the things that we do, that sort of mindset right there is really important. It's sort of central to being able to address some of the areas of bias and unintended impact? How do we actually get a more holistic picture, right, of our data? Are we considering all the factors? Are we thinking about this solution or this problem in the most complete way, right? And that's what the constructs you were talking about. If we do that, then that makes it, we consider that in a very complete fashion, then it makes it simpler for us to think about, or more complete for us to have a structure for how we analyze this, how we evaluate our problem, our approach, the data that we collect, and then we will likely have different outcomes, as a result. And so I thought that was really a great example that you really honed in on to really tell the story of why the diversity, and not just diversity of thought, because sometimes when we think about diversity and we talk about that in the context of teams, people think only that we need to have people from different disciplines involved, right? So we need to have a subject matter expert if we're working on something for health sciences. You want to make sure that we have the right resource, and maybe there's a doctor involved and that sort of thing. But I'm not just talking about just in the context of the disciplines, but also those lived experiences, those backgrounds, because they're going to think about the problem and the data slightly differently.
Yes.
Right? They're going to approach how you look about it. Just think about the differences between men and women for a moment. And I might speak sort of generally. So let's go with the 80% rule. Think about the differences that we commonly hear about men and women, right? That men may be more analytical than women are, or that men perhaps are more single focused and women can multitask, right? If you just think about some of those basic distinctions, think about how that could influence the data and how we approach a problem.
Exactly.
Right? So now, right, if you're thinking about this sort of, men are charged in some ways to what do they say? They will they look to solve a problem, but again, if they're singly focused and they may not be thinking about some of the other areas of impact. There's a book that says men are like what is it? I know there's a book that says men are from Venus and women are from Mars. They're saying like we come from two other planets, but then there's another one that talks about women's sort of thought, waffles versus spaghetti. That's what it is. Waffles versus spaghetti. So think about waffles. They're little boxes, compartments. And they say that men tend to compartmentalize things, and things don't come outside of the boxes. So that means some of the connections that you might think of may not exist when they're thinking about a problem. They say women think about things and approach things like spaghetti. It's all intertwined. The noodles are touching, things are related. And I'm using that. And again, this is somewhat stereotypical, but go with me for a moment. If you think about that sort of concept, right? And you think about who is predominantly in the room when we are driving decisions, creating constructs, training and collecting data and models, right? And training our models, who are doing that? It's men. So the connectedness of certain things or concepts may not be coming into play, perhaps, right? Maybe some of the relationships that you might want to consider, or the way that women might think about it, may not be factored into the data and the results in the same way. And I'm not saying that this is true all of the time, but the reality is you're missing something, right? If we only have a certain population, a majority group. And there's also a distinction when we talk about this in the context of majority ways of thinking or majority populations versus a non-majority or minority or even marginalized communities, right? They're going to have different lived experiences that make them key into and see things sometimes differently and want us to consider things differently. And so they all have to be brought to bear when we talk about diversity. And so I really wanted to just pick up and sort of double click on what you were saying, Susanna, because I think that example was great. And it really tells, a good, gives us a good picture of how you want to think about expanding sometimes our data sets and expanding our thought process around these. So really, really great to hear. The other thing is you mentioned about where bias starts in the algorithms, right? But the other thing, and I think we were getting to this towards the end, is really that we all have biases.
Yes.
And we talk about this a lot in inclusion and diversity circles. And I think it's applicable in this context as well, because the whole question, and just for a moment, bear with me, AI ethics for me and sort of responsible use is as much a inclusion, diversity, and equity problem as it is a technology problem, right?
Exactly.
So when I look at this stuff, I bring both of those things to the table. Of course, it's sometimes hard for me to separate because I'm an African-American woman, right? So I've got two of those things that I'm considering. And I come from a meager, or some people would say poor background. So there's a different perspective and lived experience that I bring to the conversation than someone perhaps who was privileged, someone perhaps who, is from a majority population. But this whole question of bias, when we talk about this, right? Bias exists and we all have it. The thing that we want people to be thinking about, or the thing that we want people to do, is disrupt the bias, is interrupt the bias. And that only happens with intentional steps. And then for those of us that aren't keyed in or being intentional, then we have to have structures in place to force us to look at the other perspective, to force us to include other factors, to force us to have a second look, right? So that's where we get our auditing and our review and iteration and evaluation, right? Those things are our mechanisms. Those things are the structures we put in place, because sometimes we're all not going to be thinking about how we interrupt our bias. So we can't just assume because I put people in a room, now we're done. Right? We also need the processes and the structure in place in an organization so that where the checks and balances. I know you're supposed to do this. Maybe you didn't, perhaps you did, but here's another checkpoint, right? And in product development and software development, you often see we have stage gates or life cycle, in the life cycle where there are places where we check and evaluate that we've done the things that we need to do to go to the next stage, right? The same things are what we want to have in place. And I think that's part of the overall responsible development and use construct that we want organizations to have, so that they don't rely on one person, the data scientist, to be thinking about everything, but then we educate our product managers and we educate our other, technology influencers to be thinking about these areas. And then you have the data scientist and a designer who has the right sort of user-centered design to be thinking about it. And then you bring in and then you make sure your QA testers know to look for and evaluating data certain ways, and we'll be looking for areas of bias. And then we put that in every cycle, every place of the process of the life cycle, so that we have throughout the process this sort of infusion of steps to evaluate and inspect what we're building, what those outcomes are, and where there is potential impact. And there's got to be a place where we also go, if we're seeing something that's a little out of whack or not appropriate, that then we then go revisit the cycle and sort of run through this again, right? We don't just push things forward in production and go, well, it was only a small group of people, or it only had this small impact, right? That we actually can iterate and improve. And so I'm a strong proponent of testing, right? And really having a very structured test processes in the life cycle and evaluating of data. And yes, Susanna, you mentioned this as well. Sometimes it takes a little more time, but I think that, and this is the conversation we have to have, right? Investing the time in the beginning is far better than the outcomes or the risks that we have to then, or the impact that we have to then navigate around later on. And for some people, that's a lot more meaningful than others, because we're at the tail end, or we're the brunt of, or we're experiencing the result of those impacts. So we have to start to have a conversation that other people see it and feel it and are willing to do the early work, right? So we prevent the backlash, we prevent the media storms, we prevent the loss of the reputational harm, right? Because those are some of the risks when we don't do the work right, or some of the obvious risks The other ones are like what you were describing, where people don't get the healthcare they need, or someone doesn't get the right, drug dosage, or someone ends up in jail that shouldn't have been, and someone is picked up on the street where they shouldn't, or we didn't pay attention to, the outcome of a specific verdict, right? Like those things, real world impact. And there are some smaller ones, like we don't get the information we expect to get when we put something into the system or research, a certain platform or whatever the case may be. So there are some smaller impacts, but broader, and we need people to understand those all to help us, really start to tackle, because it's part of all of our work, collective work. When we're, looking at product development across the life cycle, we all have a part to play. And that's part of my message to our corporations and enterprises. Like there is a piece that all of us have to do and really tackling this. And yes, there perhaps is a little bit of extra work, but it's the right kind of work, risk versus reward, right? Or the trade-off in terms of having to have the discussion around trade-offs for, some early investment for better outcomes in the end.
That's a great discussion and great pointers. I really like the fact that you want to introduce this as part of a stage gate or part of the different options as you go through the process and the development. We have a couple of questions, and I don't know if people wanted to speak up or.
Yes, I think it's better if they can unmute and ask the question so that we don't miss it.
So we have.
Good if you direct and call us, because there are a bunch of questions.
Okay. So you want me to just call them out and start to respond? So I see one here that says, what's it like to get all the different business partners to buy in and get involved? So that's like sort of tried and true sort of business transformation, stakeholder alignment, organizational change sort of stuff. And that varies depending on where the customer is. One of the things that I use in order to have those discussions is to go back to corporate values, right? So, part of this, when we start to think about responsible use or ethics, is about value alignment, right? Because there's one piece where organizations will respond to legal requirements, and we don't have a lot of that right now. So what other things do you use? We can, like we said, we can talk about the trade-offs, we can talk about risk versus reward, but the other thing is, what are the corporate values of that particular organization? What do they say is their mission, their vision? What are the objectives that they're looking, and see if there are ways that we can connect the dots in terms of what would be responsible and ethical as far as our strategy for artificial intelligence and other technologies that align to, that mission, vision, value. So an example I often use is, an organization is responsible for in the prison systems, and they want to listen in and start to evaluate certain input that they get from inmate calls. But in that data that they start to mine and look at, they find out that someone wants to commit suicide or is threatening to harm themselves. What do? Right? And so part of this is, well, what are your corporate values? In their statement, it indicates that they value and are concerned with inmate well-being. Well, if a person is going to commit suicide, that certainly affects their well-being, doesn't it? So then you get to go back and have a discussion, right? Now there's a point for us, there's a common thread. We can make certain ethical or decisions about our technology here, because and encourage them to look at perhaps their approach differently, because they say that they value inmate well-being. So what does that look like, right? How do we align that? And so it really is about, trying to align values there. But as far as the approach, it is really talking about, stakeholder alignment and agreements and sort of change or organizational change management. That's kind of the core approach that we have to drive as far as that is concerned. How does the enterprise expect employees to get up to speed on these topics? Do they do internal training? Many organizations aren't, but that's part of our steps or encouragement to organizations, is actually to do it. And when they train, they often only train the data science community or the AI teams. And we're seeing that, that training needs to be a little bit more holistic, right? And so product managers, your chief data officer, your CTO, if they're involved, QA resources, other people that are going to be a part of the life cycle that influence decisions about artificial intelligence and are a part of the overall life cycle, they need to be trained as well. And that training is going to vary as far as how in depth we go technically, but it should be giving them a context for understanding risk and bias. Some of the historical context, perhaps around biases and the impacts that it can have. And also when we get down to like data scientists, of course, like what do we do to mitigate it, or how are we approaching this, right? And specific tools that they can use and all of that stuff. So it's going to vary, but we absolutely should be educating our teams and our workforce, and that needs to get more into the plan and the cycle. It's not always happening today. Typically in projects, how long are the concept, idea, data collection, and defining constructs? Assume constructs can be changed during the course of the 5 cycles. How long? I think that depends on the projects and how, that overall scope and how long. I mean, I've seen some things where data collection is quite lengthy, right? And sometimes could be longer than some of the other parts of the cycle, depending on what they're collecting and what market they have to pull data from, what sources they have access to. So I think all of these, it could be a couple of weeks to months. Some data collection exercises I've seen in particular in some of the social contexts, social sciences areas are multi-month efforts, because they're not only just pulling data from a source, but they actually are doing research or putting in constructs to gather data from people and from other sources, and then put them in a repository to have access to. So I think it differs, but yes, we're talking about introducing a little bit of additional work or some other steps to each one of those areas in the cycle.
I think there was one more question by
Nandini had a question. Nandini, do you want to speak up? I know you have experience in the car, but I believe it might be better if you speak up your question.
Is this the one?
Yes, coming online.
I think she answered it.
Yeah, I think Dia just answered it. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yeah. So basically, so I was wondering is, you're on this project to build AI solution. What is the time span do you invest in, data collection and adding the ethical aspect of it to those initial 2-3 stages of that process, so that you can identify, okay, how long will it take for me to build this solution given, and I see that you said that it could vary depending upon the kind of project you're working on.
Yeah, and I think some of the effort is, perhaps 10 to 20% additional. And again, it depends on where we are in the cycle. Sometimes we get involved, they've already done data collection. So now we're going and saying, okay, we want to go back and look at your data, right? And so in that case, that might be a little bit more work in labor intensive than if you're early in the process and you're not trying to have to repeat, stages, but that you can say, think about these things and sort of guide them with specific parameters, constructs, as Susanna said, for them to look at their data and to collect the data. So ideally, you want to be early in the cycle or early in the workflow or process, so we can start to influence how they do everything. But sometimes it happens like we're coming in after that's done, and now we're going to review the data and look, and then of course that could be a little bit more time. But I would say probably on average, some 10 to 20% additional effort that we're saying should be potentially in every stage along the way to sort of incorporate some of the things that they may not be doing today. what we ultimately want is that this becomes the standard, right? So that we're not thinking, oh, this is extra work, but this is the way that we do work.
Yeah. And also, I guess we also have to consider legal implications, right? So I would assume those things would come in the initial stages when we are collecting and analyzing data.
Say that again.
I mean to say, I assume there would be, like, if there are legal implications of your outcome or of your output, right?
Yes.
So when do you consider those legal impacts or implications, right? I would think it would be right up front when you're
ideally, right?
Ideally.
So when we're looking at the solutioning or understanding that, I mean, part of our initial sort of problem statement and understanding that is looking at what regulation is in place. And that varies. So there's going to be regulation that is standard for an organization or depending on the industry. And then there's going to be some limited guidelines that we may have as a result, as far as artificial intelligence, because there is, again, limited a little bit in the way of legal or guidance or regulation at this particular time, but that is going to change. So we want to ideally look at that when we're defining the problem, right? We want to be able to have that understanding that, so that helps inform our approach. But we also know that sometimes, again, depending on where you fit in the life cycle, we want to go back and look at the data or look at the output, look at inferences, and determine, are we doing something here that's wrong? Was there data drift and something adjusted? And now we're in the wrong area, right? Now we're in the area of risk. And so inspection is necessary all the time. Like there needs to be a cycle of that so that you could go back and continue to reevaluate.
Yeah. Thanks, Dia.
Can I have like one last question before Dia?
Can I have a question, Susanna? We can't let Dia go with the last question so soon. I know she's coming back to the class and she's going to do
Yes, I will.
Class. But there are some people here who are not part of the class. So I want to make sure that, at least we get a little bit more from you, and then those, if they want to sign up, they can. Sam has a question, and then Susanna, maybe then you can have the last question. Sam, do you want to speak up?
Yeah, thank you, Sita, and for inviting me to this. It's been absolutely fantastic. I just wanted to ask you, just from your experience, do you find that there are particular sectors or industries that are more open to building in these processes in the early stages, particularly with reference to the questions about early on defining the potential risks and biases? How do you have, from your experience, particular sectors that you've worked in?
So we're seeing a lot of interest in financial institutions as well as like in public sector. So those that are going to be that usually are driven by more regulation and compliance requirements. But we certainly are seeing, at least my experience, is seeing quite a bit of interest there.
Thank you. That's great.
Healthcare probably is another, but healthcare and life sciences already they've long had a structure of ethics and ethical considerations. Bioethics has been around, for a while. So the other industries, as far as AI is starting to just step into this area, but that's existed for a while. But I think finance and financial industry, so that's both like financial institutions and insurance and that sort. They're really, their interest is growing and areas of public sector. And I think some of that is driven by, there is increasing probability of regulation to come, right? Here in the US, after the National Artificial Intelligence Commission issued their documents, and the EU recently released, found the groundwork and foundation for what will potentially go into law there. And so I think they're probably, if we say leaders, in some ways, leaders in looking at this.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. I'll look into those too. Thank you. That's great. Cheers. Thank you, Dia.
Well, I've got to run, but I so appreciate the opportunity to share with you all today. Great conversation, Susanna. Really great to see you as well, and you sharing And I look forward to jumping in and having more discussion with y'all in the next,
Yes.
those of you that are joining the class in the next class.
Yeah, thank you, Dia. Thank you, Susanna. This has been
so
a
much, Dia. Thank you so much, Susanna. This is fantastic. We'll see you on Thursday, and we'll see you tomorrow in Anika's masterclass. So thanks everybody.
Thank you, Dia, so much. Thanks for coming around. I mean, it's so great to see you again. I'm so impressed with her Amazon story. I hope you will get to hear it in the masterclass.
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I just noticed the link we shared had some broken link. Thank you for whoever tried to go click and alerted us. So if you go to businessschoolofai.com, it says registration is closed because we closed registration and started a cohort of class. We opened up, just sign up for the masterclass, and you can sign up for Anika's masterclass for tomorrow or Dia's masterclass for next Thursday, just for that session. We try to set up some code and all that, so you can just join the masterclass at $199. And that link is broken, so apologies. So if you go to businessschoolofai.com/AI ethics course, it should work there. And you can use the code Ankita special. I'm typing that, Ankita-special. Or you can use the code DIA AWS. And that should give you the $199 price till Monday, I believe. And you can join the masterclass. So please try that. Whoever was trying to go there, please let us know if that works. And we are adding all the extra resources from Susanna's presentation today straight here in the course page. So even if you're not attending the course, if you go to the course page, you can actually see the resource list and go enjoy that. So hope you'll join the class. If not, we will see you next week and at Weekly Wednesday. And be well, and hope you're motivated to get into AI ethics like Susanna got me started here. So we'll see you all next week. Oh, Richard is actually sharing an email. So if you have any questions or follow-ups, or even considering the course or considering anything else that you have as a follow-up question, you can email weeklywed@businessschoolofai.com. And we will see you all next week. And rest of the class who's already here, we'll see you tomorrow. And thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.